friends, I remember when I was young, my family, I remember there's a season of our life where we had a membership at our local YMCA back home, back up in Michigan. And I remember at that time, both my parents were really in a place of wanting to get fit, get healthy, right? It may have been the start of a new year, so maybe this sounds a little familiar to you. But I remember we would, come home from school, we'd eat dinner, do our chores, and we'd all pile in the car and head off to the Y to do our thing. And I remember being so young, maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, and being so kind of nervous to walk into the Y. I had no idea what to expect. I had all these ideas of what a fitness center was like, right? And so I was a little scared walking into the Y for the first time. I was a little worried because I thought I'd walk into this place, right, and I'd see these, burly men walking around, these enormous chests with barrels of arms, right, and they're yelling and grunting and clashing of weights and all these things. And I expected to see as a kid, right, these people running around the track or on a treadmill like they're training for the Olympics, or people swimming these laps in the pool to try to be the next Michael Phelps and all these things. And I thought, like, that's not really me, right? That's not really for me. I feel so intimidated, right, being right next to somebody who's like sprinting on a treadmill or kind of racing through the elliptical or lifting hundreds of pounds. And I've got like a $5 or 5 pound weight dumbbell, right, as a little kid, like, oh, come on. But I remember as we walked in, kind of took a tour and saw the place, I've had this kind of awakening moment as awe filled my heart of, oh my goodness, this place was built for me. I don't know what the YMCAs are like here in our area, but the one that we were at back home, you see, while there were dumbbells and weights and bench press and all those things, there were also vending machines. While there were pools and laps and people using them, there were also pool tables for you to relax around and to enjoy. While there was a track to, get up on your feet and run around and race around, there was also a lounge with TVs and sofas and all these things. I remember walking around and seeing this man, right, so vividly. I remember this man took a break from lifting some weights in the bench press, and he sat up and he grabbed not his protein shake, but a Pepsi. He took a swig. Right, I saw this other man who was walking on the treadmill, and I saw on the tray in front of him, it was an open wrapper of a Snickers bar. And I'm like, these are my kind of people, right? Like, this is where we belong. Oh, how easy it would be, right, to go to the Y every single day and never lose a pound, right? At least that particular YMCA. I have no idea what the ones are like here in our area. How easy it would be, right, to be in a place where it's kind of built around the idea of getting healthy, getting fit, but how easy it would be, right, to be there and to never burn a calorie. To probably actually gain more calories while you're there than actually lose. And there's this reality, right, as human beings, there's this reality that it's so easy for us to be in kind of a position or close in proximity to an environment that ought to make us grow, but we don't. It's so easy for us to go through our years in high school and to never be prepared for adulthood. It's so easy for us to get married, right? And we're supposed to kind of grow up. God created marriage, right, to be this beautiful union between a man and a woman where they'd be made holy, right, as they're both chasing after him. That they'd be, enriched and grown, and that they would develop and mature, right, as individuals, right, but yet as they are one together. In so many spaces in our life, we find it so easy to sit or just to be present, but not really to be stretched and to grow. And we've brought that reality right into our walk with God, and for some reason we've kind of developed this idea that we can sit in a pew, or in our case, a metal chair to middle school, for many, many, many years. And we somehow mature overnight like we're cheese or wine. We somehow just naturally, even though we're not being intentional about it, even though we're not putting effort forward in it, it somehow just comes about on its own. We have these ideas. And for a while, they've really been robbing us of our journey with Christ, because it's been taking away so much of what God is looking to bring about in our life, and He's looking to bring about in us, the insecurities, the doubts, and the fear, and the pressures, and the anxiety, all these things that God is looking to kind of change within our mind and how we approach and live our life. We never get to walk in. And we miss out on a lot of the deep changes that God is looking to do within us. And so this morning, for the next 7 weeks, we're beginning this journey called Soul Shift. We're going to press through 7 major shifts, these deep changes that God is really looking to bring about within our soul, these changes within our life and how we approach our relationship with God. And I really believe through this series, as we study it here on Sunday morning, and as we go through the same material right through our groups that we're starting tonight, and I just encourage you, if you haven't yet, look at being a part of the groups that we're starting tonight. There's one tonight, there's one on Tuesday night as well. And listen, these are great ways to be plugged in, to build relationships, but also to grow in our faith. And so I urge you, it doesn't matter if you've been here for a few years or a few months, a few weeks, listen, look at being a part of these groups. Because it truly is a great way to build community. It's a great way, with the chaos of the world, for us to rest in the presence of God and rest in the presence of godly friends. Okay? So I urge you for that. But through this series, we're going to talk through some shifts that God is looking to bring about within us. And this morning, we're going to talk through this first shift, this shift called Ask to Listen. Okay? If you're taking notes, I encourage you to write that down. Ask to listen, right? Should be right here on the screen. Ask to listen to this first shift that we're going to talk through. You see, last week, this is actually something that we were going to talk about 5 weeks from now. It was actually on my preaching calendar for us to not even get to this shift until the beginning of March, but because of what happened last Sunday, I decided to bring this to the very front of the line. Because last Sunday, something really incredible took place as we were here in this place, and as we talked through what it looked like for us as individuals to be called of God. Right? We wrestled through this tension of the God of the universe looking to us as finite, small people in all the universe, right? And is looking to call us into something, to call us forward, to use us, to grow us, to build us in some kind of way. And what was remarkable, church, what was truly incredible, is that there was so much discussion at the very end about how on earth do we know that God is calling us? How do we hear His voice? I mean, more than any other sermon we've ever walked through together on Sunday, many of you brought up those questions, that discussion of Pastor, how do we know that God is speaking to us, right? How do we know that what we feel is God and not just some other feeling? How do we know that God is really speaking into our mind and our heart and our soul? How do we know that He's leading us? We wrestled through some questions last week, and I encourage you to, if perhaps you missed it, watch it online on YouTube, Facebook, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can listen to our church's podcast, all of our sermons that way. But this reality that God is calling us, He's speaking to us. And for many of us, we feel a little defeated because we hear other people, right? We hear other people who they hear God speak to them, and they hear it and they know it, right? And yet we ourselves don't experience that. I mean, we love God, we're in church, all these things, right? We're trying to get our life together, all this stuff that we feel like we've got to be doing. And yet we hear these things about God speaking to us, but we miss it. And we're hungry, right? We're hungry for God to lead us. We're hungry for His will. We're hungry to know what is it He wants us to do. Amen, church? We're hungry. What is it God wants from me? What is His will? And so we're in this weird, awkward place of wanting God to speak and wanting to understand what He's trying to say, but yet I feel like we're missing it. And that tension came to the surface last Sunday, which is why we're going to press into it, especially today at the start of this new series, the shift from ask to listen. Ask to listen. You see, because there's this beautiful moment with Jesus in the Gospels, in the Gospel of John, we see happen. It begins in chapter 9, and it flows into chapter 10, and we're going to read a little bit later, chapter 10. But this beautiful moment where Jesus is kind of drawing together his disciples, and he meets this man who's been born blind. Maybe you know the story. He meets this man who's been born blind, and he's been blind, his whole life for several years, many decades probably. And Jesus then comes into this moment, and he spits in some dirt, and he makes the mud, and he picks it up and he puts it in this man's eyes. I can only imagine his disciples looking in and watching, like, is he really about to do this, right? How crazy. How bizarre is that? But Jesus does it. He spits the dirt, puts it together, right? Makes some mud, puts it in this man's eyes, and he tells him, hey, listen, there's a fountain over there. Go wash off in the fountain. And so the man does it, and he can see, and it's this incredible miracle that takes place, this healing. And he's ecstatic. And some Pharisees, these religious leaders, kind of come into the moment and begin kind of badgering this man with all these questions. Like, how did this happen? All this stuff. They're making all these judgments. Like, I bet you your parents had sinned, right? Which is why God cursed you in this way. And so that's probably why you've been blind. How on earth could this happen, right? How could you now see? And so they're making all these accusations, these questions. And all of a sudden then Jesus kind of re-enters the moment, and he kind of speaks to everyone there. The man who would pronounce the Pharisees who were there angry, frustrated, and then his disciples who are also with him. And then he talks for a moment about spiritual blindness. And he says, listen, I've come into the world to judge. It's kind of a harsh moment. I've come to bring judgment, and I'm come to help the blind to see, and those who think they can see realize that they're blind. And the Pharisees are still confused. And then Jesus tells a parable. He talks through this parable of some sheep in a pen. And I want us to read it together because I believe it's so rich and so significant in our journey to really be people who hear from our God. Let's read it together. It's in John chapter 10, verses 1 to 5. And it should be right here on the screen too. But very truly I tell you, Pharisees, Jesus speaking. Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought them out all on his own, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. And the Pharisees in this moment are still angry, still confused, asking what on earth is going on. And then if we're to continue to read, Jesus continues to explain. He simply just says, listen, I'm the gate, right? Use your imagination with me in this moment. Imagine this enormous field, right? Having grown up in Michigan where there are lots of fields, lots of farms. Listen, use your imagination and picture just this flat land and all this huge wooden fence that just surrounds it. Beautiful country, right? And imagine all these sheep who are in it, and there's this gate. And imagine, Jesus is describing, he says, listen, I am the gate. He says that in the next couple of verses, if we continue to read. He says, I am the gate. He says, people who want to be on the inside of the pen, they've got to come through me to be in the pen. But then there are also people who just hop the fence. And he also talks through how I am not just the gate, I'm also the shepherd who's leading these sheep. These are my flock, right? And it's actually incredible because as he goes on to explain, he even says a little bit later in verse 16, he talks about how there's another sheep pen. And he's talking about this reality of the Gentiles who will one day, right, be the people of God along with the Jewish the Jewish nation. And so it's this incredible vision that Jesus is bringing about this reality that he's kind of foreshadowing to. But he says that I'm the gate. And those who are sheep, they enter through me. And there are those who can pretend. There are those who will act like sheep, but they'll just jump over the fence. And in our pursuit to answer this question, how on earth can I hear God's voice? It's so essential that we lean into what Jesus is trying to stir up. He's trying to stir up this question of where are we with God? This is so significant for us to really lean into, because he's trying to get us to really wrestle with this question of have I just hopped the fence? Or have I really walked into this through Christ? Because for many of us, we grow up in church. We grow up with parents, right, who brought us to Sunday school in the morning, church service right after it, right, then church at that night, and then Wednesday night. We grew up in that life, and so we grew up in this constant rhythm of being in church and learning the Word and all of these things. And so we say, yeah, I believe in God. Oh, yeah, I'm a Christian. But we never really made the decision for ourselves to say, you know what, I see my sin. I see how bad I need Jesus. And I repent of my sin. We never had this moment of really deciding for ourselves if we want to believe. And so we go through many of our days having just hopped the gate. My parents believe, so I do too. My grandma took me, so I do too, right? And so we just kind of have this kind of casual, nominal faith where since we grew up in a family and a culture and a community and a neighborhood where everybody just went to church, everybody says they believe, everybody says they're Christian, that's just what you do, right? As well, just as we drink water from the faucet, we believe in God. We can't even imagine ourselves or saying to our family that we don't believe in God. But yet we never have made a concrete decision for ourselves to say, you know what, I really need Jesus. I realize how broken I am. I realize that if I don't have Jesus, then I'm lost. So many of us, we go through our days never really realizing that we need Jesus more today than we did yesterday. We don't really have those conversations with God anymore about, Lord, I'm so broken and I need you. God, please forgive me. And so Jesus asks us this question that we've got to talk through, right, for us ourselves individually. Or where are we with him? Do we view ourselves as a sheep because we know we came in through the gate? Because we said, Jesus, I need you. I realize that you died on the cross for me. I give you my life. I want to follow you. Or do we see ourselves as a sheep just because we hopped the fence? But as Jesus is in this moment describing all of this stuff, he doesn't just want everyone listening to wrestle with this question, where are we with God? He especially wants us to wrestle with the question, how well do we know God? Because he says that I'm the shepherd. He says later on in verse 12, he says, I'm the good shepherd. And he says that I know my sheep. He even said earlier in verse 3 or 4, when we read, he said, they're my sheep and I know them by name. And he says later on, is that my sheep know me. That they know me. That they know me. And we fall into this rhythm of knowing about God, but not really knowing God. This deep reality that our connection with him and how well we can hear his voice in our life and listen to him, build a relationship with him, and how well we can know him. The way we interact with our spouse or someone we're dating determines how well we know them. We know that they feel loved if we serve them or we appreciate them or whatever it could be, and so we live in that kind of way to let them know that we love them, to go out of our way to love them. How on earth can we live in a relationship with God if we hardly know Him? This reality that God has given us His Word. He's given us this so that we would know Him. I've heard a lot. I didn't grow up in church at all my whole life, but I heard a lot when I was older that there's this acronym to describe this. It's called, Bible, basic instructions before leaving Earth. And I've heard that many times. Maybe you've heard that too. And I see some, why that could be a good acronym to use to describe this. But at the same time, it's a really bad way to explain what this is. Because it's not just a basic list of instructions. I remember when I was in high school, I fell in love with reading. I don't know why it took all the way till high school, but I was so stubborn in my younger years of reading, and I don't want to read, no, I don't want to do that, right? But I remember I read just this novel that I fell in love with, and from there it just spurred on this habit I have of even now today loving to read. And I enjoy reading, and I remember in high school reading through different novels and fictional books and different series and different things like that. And it's so fun to learn about characters one page at a time. It's so fun to learn about people because you don't just learn everything about whatever character is in the story at the very beginning. You learn about them through the entire book. And the reality is that God has given this to us that we would learn about who He is one page at a time. This deep reality that this book is the history of God pursuing mankind. It is the stories, the history, right? Sometimes we treat this like it's a bunch of stories collected in a bottle, in a glass jar that's put on a shelf aside from the rest of the world's history. No. It's all together within world history. These are events, real moments of people being pursued by God. And we learn about who our God is through seeing how He chased after other people. Adam and Eve, Noah who built the ark, Abraham and his sons and his descendants, right? Joseph, we learn about how he chases after Moses and how he chases after Joshua and all the leaders of the people of God in the Old Testament, right? All through the Judges, and we read about how God, he built up this people to follow Him and how He pursued this nation of people, how He pursued a man named Saul, who became king, and a man named David, who later became king, and Solomon, and all these leaders. We see how God pursued other people in Scripture like Nehemiah and Ezra and Job, these people who were called, right, in different ways. We read how He pursues Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Elisha and Elijah. We read about all these people like Jonah. We just talked about his story last week. All these people like Daniel. These stories in the Old Testament of God pursuing people. We learn about God's heart for humanity and God's heart for us when we read these rich and real moments of God pursuing people. And the reality that in the New Testament, God said, you know what, I'm tired of shouting over the fence. Because throughout the Old Testament, God is shouting over the fence to His neighbor, so to speak. And He says, you know what, I'm tired of shouting, I'm just going to hop the fence and be with you. And so God put on flesh and bone and lived a life as a man. From a baby to a full-grown man who died on the cross, but then rose from the dead. A man who was fully human, but also fully God. Christ. And we read these stories of Jesus spitting in mud, spitting in dirt and healing people. We read these stories of Jesus protecting those who are oppressed. We read stories of Jesus chasing after people. This reality that oh my goodness, that's our God. We see as we read through the book of Acts, right, how God raises up leaders within the church, people like Peter and people like Paul, a man who murdered Christians but now is leading the church. And we see how God pursues humanity, and it shows us who he is. It's impossible for us to know God if we don't read this. It's impossible for us to be sheep who've walked through the gate and who know our shepherd if we don't read this. If we don't devote ourselves to the Word and to learning about who our God is and how he cares for us and how he created us with purpose and meaning, we miss all of it. And we miss who he is if we don't read this. It's important for us to ask ourselves that question: how well do we know God? How well do we know God? Do you know God because you've heard your parents talk about him? Because you've just heard me talk about him? Because you've heard other pastors or other people talk about him? Because you heard someone on the radio sing about him? Do you know him just through the Bible verse that somebody shared on Instagram or somebody posted on Facebook? Or do you know him because you slowed your life down enough and to come into a moment of reading this and saying, Lord, I want you. I need you. I mean, Jesus said, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will what? Be filled. That we'd be hungry to know him. And so I urge you, if you don't have a Bible that you read regularly, then get one. I recommend 2 different translations. I recommend the NIV Bible, which is what I preach from every week, and I recommend the New Living Translation, which is a little bit easier to read. And I recommend that you also get a study Bible, because there are notes, because sometimes we read something and we have no idea what we just read. And it's helpful to have notes that break it down and help us understand. But if we're going to know our God, if we're going to know our shepherd, that way we can know our voice, his voice, then we must be reading. We must be chasing after him. Because there are a lot of voices in the world that we can listen to. And that's why Jesus draws this third question in front of us as we're trying to hear his voice. He asks us this third question of who are we listening to? Because he talks to us about how the shepherd, right, he is calling to us. He is leading us with his voice, and sheep will follow him. But then he also says that there are strangers who will call to him. And he says that the sheep who know me will come with me. They'll run away from the stranger. But yet, if we don't really know our shepherd, then we easily listen to the wrong voice. And this is actually really where this shift from ask to listen really begins to take off, because it's this deep reality that God is leading us forward to become people who ask him and listen to him over asking the world or asking other places or other sources or other people and listening to them before we listen to him. This shift of ask to listen goes from asking others to now I'm going to listen to God. Now you got to decide for ourselves who we're going to listen to. I remember being a kid and going to my grandparents' house, and I loved going to their house. I loved the garden, the backyard. I loved the fruit trees they had. I loved my grandfather's workshop he had in his basement that we'd go down and build things with. And I hated whenever it was a rainy day, because it meant we couldn't go outside, and it meant that we were probably just going to play some games or watch some TV. And surprisingly, we hated watching TV at my grandparents' house, because they had one of those really small black TVs that's like this big that has the VHS player built in. You know what I'm talking about, right? Come on. Who grew up, who had one of those in their house, right? Yes, right? I know my in-laws still have one in their house, but the small little black TV, right, with the VHS player built in. And they didn't have cable. They didn't have a giant library of VHS movies. They had these two big metal wires that stuck out of the top of it, right? That you had to go and play with to get some signal. You know what I'm talking about? Some rabbit ears, some antennas. We hated watching TV because there, my siblings and I, we'd crowd into this bedroom because the TV wasn't in the living room. It was in one of their bedrooms. And so we'd all sit on the bed. And in one of us, we'd take turns. We'd get up, we'd turn the TV on, and then we would spend what felt like decades trying to correct the antennas to get a signal. And all you'd hear for what seemed like hours upon hours of the static, right? And then we finally wised up and turned the volume down, right? Can't believe it took us that long to realize that, but after a while, though, you get a hang of it, don't you? After a while, you get a hang of where you got to point the antennas to get the right signal. Friends, we've been listening to static for a long time. And we get really impatient because we spend all of the length of time of a Google search to say, God, I don't want to hear your voice, but he doesn't speak, so all right, we go on. And we just listen to more static. It takes time to learn how we can adjust the antennas within our soul to really hear him. At first, as we sit and read and we come to the Lord saying, God, I need you to fill me, at first it will take a while. At first it will take a while to get a clear signal. But trust me when I say, after a while of being hungry and saying, God, I only want to listen to you, you'll get really good at adjusting the signals the right way. And after years and years of being hungry for the Lord and being, God, I just want to know you. I just need your voice. And we're just dedicated and committed to being led by him after time and years. We get really good. We get really good at grabbing the antennas and knowing right where we need to put them to hear God's voice. Because the reality is, church, how will we know when we hear God's voice? It's as clear from static to a clear channel. As we spend time and learn who God is, we'll realize that he never contradicts this. He'll never tell me to do something that he says I should not do in here. As a pastor, I've seen many people who will say, yeah, I really feel like God is telling me to do this. And I'll be like, you know what? You should double check, because God is pretty straightforward to say you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't leave your wife because you feel like God is telling you to. God will never contradict himself. And the reality is when we develop this skill of listening and getting our soul in tune with God, we'll realize that we'll know his voice because his voice comes from within us. Understand that. His voice will come from within us. I mean, God says that when we come into a relationship with him, right, when we enter through the gate, not jumping over, when we come through Christ, when we say, Jesus, listen, I am full of sin, and I need your sacrifice on the cross to pay my sin. I need you to pay my debt that I owe. And when we ask the Lord to forgive us of our past, and we enter into this relationship with him, where we still continually say, God, I need you to forgive me for this. I need you to forgive me for this. But when we enter through the gate and we're in this relationship with him, God says, listen, my spirit is now within you. I am in you. There are a lot of mysteries to our faith. There are a lot of them, and that's okay. Remember, we are small specks in the universe. We are nothing compared to the infinite God who created it all. We will never fully understand. And that's okay. But it's the reality that God has said, your soul is kind of going to be like where I dwell. Your body and your being is going to be like a temple where I will live. And so when you hear my voice, it will come from within you. And so understand that as we are students of his word, as we are hungry to know who God is, and we're reading this, he will speak and it will come from within. And God speaks in two different types of ways. He speaks in what this giant theological term called general revelation, right? What God reveals to us through his word as we're reading, and he says things that are for all of us, right? He talks about loving your neighbor, right? That reality that God has spoken that to all of us, okay? But then there's this reality that there's this something called special revelation, right? This giant term that we never really use because it sounds so big and lofty, but this reality that God also calls us in specific ways, where he speaks something to you that he won't say to me. And maybe it's about loving your neighbor. He'll say, listen, that neighbor across the street, Tom, or whoever his name is, or whatever her name is, I want you to go over and just to see how they're doing. He'll speak to us in specific ways, and it'll come from within. And can I tell you something? You will always have to take a step of faith to listen. You always will. You will always have to take a step of faith to listen to God. You will never know for sure. And so become okay with not knowing. And so I urge you as your friend and as your pastor, when you feel like God has spoken something to you from your soul and you're a little unsure and you know that it is in line with the word, right, because you've studied this and you know him, then just do it, even if it doesn't quite make sense to you. Two stories real quick. I remember there's once when I was in college, I was working at Lowe's, and I remember I got to meet a coworker of mine. And normally, right, you know, we don't really, as we're getting to know a new friend, we don't quite say, you know, hey, I love Jesus, right? We don't really like bring that card out first, right? We for the most part, we tend to be a little shy, right? But as I was getting to know him, for some reason, you know, he made a comment about, Andre, you just seem so joyful. Like, what is it? And I remember I just felt in my heart like I needed to share, you know what? I used to live a life of misery. But yet the joy I have now is because of Jesus. And for some reason, I felt like I needed to share that exact phrase with him. And then he started to bring out some things like, oh, I hate God and all this stuff. But we created this friendship. After a few months of working together and hanging outside of work and spending time with one another and talking through things, there came a moment where he came to me and he said, you know, Andre, I remember that one day you shared that you were misery before you met God, and I'd like to know him. And I had the privilege of leading that man to Christ. I had no idea why I shared that phrase, but for some reason God used it and to plug it right into his heart, and he never forgot it. And for some reason, it brought him to the line of faith. Another story, I remember once I was driving home from work. And I was on my way, I was right around the corner from our house. And for some odd reason, I felt like God told me to stop at this gas station and get some fuel. Now I had 7/8 of a tank, right, in my truck. There's no reason for me to stop getting gas. Now I'm one of those people, when it gets to halfway, like I'm gonna stop. My wife is one of those people who, when the light goes on, that's when you get gas. And those people, you drive me crazy, all right? You do. But for some reason, I was driving home. It was late, 1 in the morning. I had to stay late and cover other shifts and do all this stuff. I was exhausted, but for some reason, I felt like God told me to stop and get some gas. And like, whatever, sure, right? So I stopped, pull up to this pump. I put the nozzle in, swipe my debit card, all that stuff, and it was like $5-6. God, that was great. Wow, what a great moment that was, Lord. Ooh, I'm glad I listened to you. But after I took the nozzle out and put it back on the little station, a man came up from behind me. And he said, hey, I was wondering if I could have some money for gas. I don't have any cash on me, so I'm like, oh, I got my card, my debit card. I'll walk over to your car and get you some gas, no problem. Walk over, and I got to meet his wife who was there, and he had a couple kids with him, and did the whole thing on the pump, and And he began to share with me that his family had just arrived in the States from Argentina, and they're traveling to go meet with some family. And he said that they had just pulled up to the gas station, they ran out of gas, and they were bawling their eyes out, and they were praying, God, would you send somebody to give us some fuel? And he said, then I saw you pull in, and I felt like God told me to come ask you. And I'm like, yeah, well, I'm honored to help you in this way, right? And we talked some more and said our goodbyes. And I prayed for his family real quick that God would take care of them and that he would continue to provide for them. And then afterwards, I remember he prayed for me. Before I left, he was like, can I pray for you real quick? I said, okay, sure. I remember we all bowed our heads, and his family didn't speak any English. But I remember saying that he began to pray for me. And I never shared with him that I was married. Maybe he saw the ring on my hand. He knew nothing about me, but he stood there and he prayed, Lord, would you bless this man with a son? He had no idea that Aaron and I had been trying for over 1.5 years to get pregnant. And it was exactly a month later when we became pregnant with Mason, our boy. It's kind of crazy in those moments when you're just hungry for God. Nothing else, right? Not what Pinterest or Facebook or Instagram, nothing that has to say, not even our family. Let's push aside even family, because family is a little crazy. Push aside everything and just say God, I want to know you. And I want to know what it's like to have crazy stuff like that happen in my life. I want to know what it's like to hear your voice. I want to know you like I know a friend. It's so important that we realize, where are we with God? Maybe we need to ask for some forgiveness. Maybe we need to bring some brokenness to him and say, Lord, would you forgive me? Maybe we need some time of reconciliation. Maybe we need to ask ourselves, God, how well do I really know you? Maybe I've just been kind of taking a little bit from everybody else around me. Maybe I've never sat and truly read this. And listen to me, a great place to begin is the Gospel of John in the New Testament, or any of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. You could read the book of Acts, which is right after John. You could read from Genesis, through several, through the books from there, all the way up to 2 Samuel. It's this beautiful continued story over thousands of years of God leading his people. And so you can read this continuous story, right? Great places to begin and say, Lord, I just want to know you. I want to know you. And listen, as you know him, it'll be so easy to know his voice. It'll be so easy to hear him speak from within and to know where he's leading you next.